Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to tune in to Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, September 9th, 2023. We begin with our dear sister Luyanda Kaboka riding the waves of history, giving us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, author, historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne will be joined on the line by Wendy Wilson-Fall, professor and chair of Africana Studies at Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania. Stay tuned to learn more about the subject of her book, Memories of Madagascar and Slavery in the Black Atlantic. Then, in the second half of our program, I will be joined on the line by sisters Inemesit Richardson and Falou Balora with the Thomas Sankara Center for African Liberation and Unity in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. They'll be discussing the origin, goals, and activities of the center, while giving us some important context on the current happenings in the Sahel region of West Africa as they fight against French imperialism. Stay tuned to find out how you can support the grassroots efforts of the Thomas Sankara Center and the Burkinabés' fight to rid their country of the remnants of French neocolonialism. Now, I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom, right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, and kpfk.org streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Erykah Badu, Kenny Dorham, McCoy Tyner, Mo Groove Miller, Sam Skladja, and H.R. the Band. Now people get ready for this train to coming, taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by a conversation with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Wendy Wilson-Fall.
Alafia to our KPFK listening audience. I'm Sister Luyanda Kaboka with our weekly African drum beat historical calendar for this week, September 5th. September 6, 1912. Ella Gray was born in Tallahassee County, Alabama. She was a socialist organizer among Southern sharecroppers. At the age of 19, she became a leader of the Sharecropper Union and organized the Young Communist League. In spite of armed attacks by local police and the murder of family members, she held the Sharecroppers Union together, fighting the exploitation by large farm owners. September 6, 1966. J.A. Rogers, Pan-Africanist historian and field anthropologist, crosses over. J.A. Rogers, a self-trained historian from Jamaica, was a Pullman porter on the railroad. He never finished high school. Rogers, when visiting various cities, would pay white Pullman conductors to go to the segregated libraries and take out books for him. Rogers also visited over 60 countries doing field research and writing articles about the conditions of African people worldwide. According to W.E.B. Du Bois, no man living has revealed so many important facts about the Negro race as has Rogers. Rogers published over 16 books, his most important being From Superman to Man, 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro, The Real Facts About Ethiopia, and World's Great Men of Color. September 6, 1972. La Raza Unida Party holds its first national convention in El Paso, Texas. La Raza Unida Party is the oldest progressive Chicano party in the United States. September 7, 1885. Jovita Ida de Juarez was born. Jovita was a Chicano journalist and fighter for Chicana and women's rights. With her newsman father and two brothers, she launched a vigorous investigation and demonstrations against the racist lynchings of Chicanos. Her family newspaper, La Crónica, was an early voice for social justice and equality. They fought white assimilation and promoted cultural pride, brown pride. She founded the Mexican Feminist League in 1911. September 7, 1974. Frelimo, Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, the African Socialist Liberation Movement, defeats the Portuguese and U.S.-backed attempt at a coup d'etat over the People's Democratic elected government. September 8, 1881. Helen Disha was born. Helen was a prolific Hawaiian composer, singer, and dancer who fought Euro-Christian missionaries as cultural imperialists as they banned native Hawaiian music and dance, including the hula, as being savage and bestial. September 9, 1948. The Korean People's Democratic Republic was founded. North Korea, one of the many socialist revolutions which characterized the post-colonial period. Today, North Korea maintains a staunch socialist political economic posture in the face of the United States and Western Europe's continued efforts at destabilization. September 9, 1882. Sarah Mapps Douglas, an African sister born in the United States, a teacher, abolitionist, and early member of the Free African Society. Sarah opened one of the first schools in Philadelphia in the 1820s. Despite racist threats and violence, Sarah continued to teach young African girls in the Institute for Colored Youth, which she took charge of in 1853. September 10, 1979. Agostinho Neto, leader of the MPLA, Movement for the Liberation of Angola, crosses over to the ancestor world. MPLA was a vanguard African popular movement which led to the defeat and subsequent decolonization of the Portuguese. September 10, 1974. Fatima Boaro crosses over. She was a guerrilla fighter and a leader in the PAIGC, the Revolutionary Liberation Movement for Guinea-Bissau, against Portuguese colonialism. Fatima joined the PAIGC after escaping from a forced marriage to a 73-year-old man when she was 19 years old. She helped architect the PAIGC Banning of forced marriages in the new revolutionary Guinea-Bissau. This has been Sister Luyanda Koboka here on KPFK 90.7 FM, Los Angeles 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara, and streaming live worldwide at www.kpfk.org. And in the voice of our ancestors in Azania, South Africa, we say, Amandla awetu, Amandla awetu, Amandla awetu.
For Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, KPFK, this is Gerald Horne for Freedom Now. And with me on the line is Wendy Wilson-Fall, Professor and Chair of Africana Studies at Lafayette College and author of the book, Memories of Madagascar and Slavery in the Black Atlantic. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Wilson-Fall.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Gerald. I appreciate it.
And we appreciate your joining us. So how did you become interested in Madagascar, this gigantic island off the southeast coast of the African mainland? And what do you tell us about Madagascar in your book?
Well, I became interested in Madagascar because I grew up with family stories about my mother's great-great-grandfather who my family believed arrived to the United States from Madagascar around 1822, I'd say between 1822 and 1824.
Mm-hmm. And that led you to do research and I assume travel to Madagascar.
Yes, eventually. I put it off for a long time because back in the old days, the idea of a native anthropologist or someone using their own material for research was very frowned upon, so I put it off for a while. Mm-hmm. But then my aunt, Sheila Thomas, and I gave a talk at a conference in Washington, D.C., and we were surprised that 9 other people showed up who also had stories of having ancestors from Madagascar.
Is that right?
Yeah, so that really piqued my interest, and that's when I really started getting serious about researching not just my family, but the phenomenon.
So your book concerns in part Madagascar and the African slave trade. Madagascar, as noted, is off the southeast coast of the African mainland, not far distant from Mozambique and South Africa. What percentage of folk from Madagascar, what percentage of the enslaved Africans in the United States had roots in Madagascar, do you suppose?
Well, in terms of the generation in which they arrived, you could say between 5 and 7%. And that is consistent with all of the Americas. In the case of the United States, there were some people who arrived in what became New York State during the 1600s. But then in the early 1700s, because the British changed their rules about Americans trading in the Indian Ocean on 2 occasions for just a few years each, there was a large influx of Malagasy slaves, captives. And so at that moment in that generation in Virginia, you could estimate anything from every 25 to every 35 people would have been a captive from Madagascar in Tidewater, Virginia.
Mm-hmm. Now, you reference these late 17th century ties between Madagascar and New York. The late celebrated anarchist anthropologist David Graeber, before he passed away recently, wrote a book about pirates of European descent on the island forming what he described as a kind of small d democracy, and even empowering indigenous women, for which he has been criticized. And I'm wondering, are you familiar with that work and how do you assess it?
Yes, I am familiar with the work, and I'd also like to mention Kevin McDonald, who's a scholar. I believe he's still in California. I'm not sure at which institution, who also did a very thorough study of the pirates in Madagascar and their relationship to North America. But the only thing that I would contend is that it didn't take the pirates to empower those women. Those women were already powerful. And they simply used the pirates to enhance the power they already had. Because most of Madagascar is what anthropologists call ambilineal, meaning that people inherit from both material goods and you could say in terms of their material selves, from both the maternal and the patrilineal line. So, yes, there was already a process of state building at that time, and of course it got accelerated with the arrival of the pirates.
Now, Madagascar, as noted, faces the African mainland on one coast, and on the other coast, it faces the Indian Ocean, and apparently there have been historic ties between the island and places as far away as Indonesia. Now, I take it that has meant a kind of phenotypical divide on the island. And with regard to the enslavers, did they concentrate on the coast facing Africa, or did they also make their way to the coast facing the Indian Ocean?
Good question. Well, first of all, we should remember that all of East Africa was enmeshed in the Indian Ocean trade, in Indian Ocean commerce, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And archaeologists have found fragments of Chinese pottery, for example, in East Africa that date back to the 9th century. So that trade already existed. It predated really any important European intervention in that area. In terms of the Indonesian the Indonesian presence, we know that migrants left Java and Sumatra and landed in East Africa about, now it must be about 1,500 years ago, maybe longer than that. And those people did not stay in East Africa for long. They took some animals and they migrated to the island of Madagascar. So they themselves were of Indonesian, if you like, or Malaysian descent. They were, in fact, Malaysians and Indonesians. But there are two other elements. Some people say, we still don't know that much about it, that there were already some people on the island. And secondly, these immigrants probably took African wives with them at some point to the island, but they quickly mixed. So you find various diverse phenotypical residences with Asia, with Indonesia in Madagascar. And of course, the language in Madagascar is a version of an Indian Ocean Austronesian language that is very similar to the languages spoken, for example, in New Zealand, among the indigenous people of New Zealand. However, over centuries, Malagasy were involved in the slave trade and brought slaves from Mozambique to Madagascar. So in addition to whatever African presence there may have been at the beginning, there was an ongoing African presence due to the slave trade. And of course, as time went on, Madagascar was involved in that trade along with Lamu and Zanzibar and the commercial activities like that in the Indian Ocean.
So, Professor Wilson-Fall, is it reasonable to infer that with regard to some of the enslaved Africans, for example, who wind up in Tidewater, Virginia, that perhaps they resembled today's Indonesians? Is that a fair inference?
Kind of. Kind of. You know, first of all, the island has different subsets of populations. And during the period of the pirates, and then later on during the period of the American colonies, most of the slaves were coming from the east coast of the island. And the people who eventually were running the most important political center in that area are called the Betsi Misaraka. So some people came from various ethnic groups or sub-language groups in eastern Madagascar. Some other people came from northwestern Madagascar. And then again, some other people, it depends on the period, were exported out of the Merina Central Plateau because of political upheaval.
Now, in
so
the
we
late
can think most of the people who came, according to the archives, most of the people who arrived in what is now the United States were shipped out of eastern Madagascar, but that doesn't mean they were all from eastern Madagascar, because in fact, they sometimes marched people across the north of the island.
Now, in the late 19th century, if not before, ties developed that we know of between Black America and Madagascar. I'm speaking of Andy Rassoff.
Right.
Who is a celebrated lyricist of Ain't Misbehavin' and Honeysuckle Rose, who dies in North Hollywood, not far distant from the KPFK studios in 1973.
Wow.
He was a direct product of this relationship. Talk to us about Andy Rassoff, if you can, and other examples of ties of singular intimacy between Black Americans and Madagascar.
Okay, well, there was a Black ambassador to Madagascar in the late 19th century, Black American. That in itself is interesting and worth investigating more. Why did they think it was a good idea for a Black ambassador to go? But at any rate, he was there, and his daughter fell in love with the son of the royal family in Merina, in the Central Plateau. By that time, the Merina people had centralized all power on the island, pretty much. And so the family that was related to Queen Ranavalona were ruling from Tananarive, but also had set up governing centers all around the island. So this young woman married the son of, I think, one of the princes of the royal family. But two things happened. One is the French really got upset, and they felt that the Americans were trying to take over all influence on the island, because the Black American ambassador was starting to take sides, who was in fact her father. Secondly, the young man who was her husband was assassinated. So when he was assassinated, she left Madagascar when she was about 7 or 8 months pregnant and ended up in New York. And incidentally, my cousin, my mother's second cousin, married him. So that was Jean, oh my goodness, who was director of the, at the New York, the Schomburg Library.
Oh, yeah. Jean Blackwell Hudson.
Jean Blackwell Hudson, right. She was my cousin.
Mm-hmm.
And she also was from the same part of the family that were descended from somebody from Madagascar, which is fascinating, although she didn't like to talk about it when I tried to interview her. And she married him. Unfortunately, didn't work out very well, but she did marry him. So that's a very intimate relationship. And
Go ahead. Sorry.
There are many instances of fairly well-known people who claim some descent from Madagascar.
Such as
Muhammad Ali.
Oh, really?
Muhammad Ali is from Kentucky, and his grandparents, I did some research on this, and his grandparents claimed, and there's no reason not to believe them, that they were the descendants of a couple who were enslaved for a shipper from Kentucky. And they arrived, I believe, in North Carolina and were brought to Kentucky. And then their daughter was taken over by the son of their white owner. And Muhammad Ali's family descended from that line. And you could find it on Google, actually. It was recounted in an interview in the press with Muhammad Ali's family, I guess like 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And also, what's his name, who was with the Black Rosicrucians? He also said he had Malagasy origins, quite a lot of people, actually.
Mm-hmm. I see.
And I think that's also because they are from Virginia. A lot of them are from Virginia. But also in a kind of a sad way, I think that, I know that most of the slaves that were brought were women. And even though the archives don't tell us this, it seems reasonable to suspect that those Malagasy women were like a prized commodity because they were different. They looked exotic. And that means that many of them may have been kept by the white planters. And that would have, unfortunately, but it's the truth, possibly given their children some advantages.
Mm-hmm.
And that would mean that those people would eventually float up to the top of the Black community because they learned how to read earlier, et cetera, et cetera. So here is the information from another family that ended up in Kentucky. So it's not even just one family, but there are a couple of families that ended up in Kentucky. For Muhammad Ali, they say Eva Clay Waddell, who was his grandmother, his paternal aunt, remembers with warmth and pride her family's history. She says, "My father was Herman Clay and my mother was Edith Greathouse Clay. They were Muhammad Ali's grandparents. All I ever heard about them was that my grandmother was a woman from Madagascar and that she and my grandfather, being Muhammad Ali's great-grandparents, were married in Louisville and their children were born there." So we remember that Muhammad Ali's name was Cassius Clay.
Also, Professor Wilson-Fall, we know that some of the fiercest resistance to colonialism, French colonialism not least, took place in Madagascar, which brings me to 1947, when the colonizers massacred tens of thousands of Malagasi's. Why did they do that?
Why did the French massacre, or why did
what triggered this massacre of tens of thousands? I mean, was there a demonstration?
Like all over the colonial world, colonialism was about extracting natural resources. And Madagascar was a source of vanilla and nutmeg. The people of Madagascar rebelled as they were trying to resist all around the world. And also, earlier, there was a huge disruption and revolution in Malagasy society in the mid-19th century, as you probably know from Gwyn Campbell, when people became converted to Christianity. So there was already this island-wide experience of resistance and fighting. So when the French tried to take over, because the French were already in the Seychelles and they were in Réunion, two smaller islands in the Indian Ocean, and initially they had been in Mauritius and imported slaves from Madagascar to Mauritius. So the people resisted, and the French, squashed the resistance.
Well, Professor...
And they brought in Senegalese, what they called, les tirailleurs sénégalais. They weren't all really actually from Senegal, but they were West African soldiers from Francophone territories that the French brought in to suppress the resistance.
Well, Professor Wilson-Fall, professor and chair of Africana Studies at Lafayette College, author of the book Memories of Madagascar and Slavery in the Black Atlantic. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles Pacifica Radio.
Well, thank you for having me. And I want your audience to know that the book is still available through Swallow Press at Ohio University if they're interested in picking it up and learning more.
Thank you for that detail.
This is Brother Brandon Sankara on Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles. And I have the privilege of being joined on the line by Sisters Inemesit, Richardson, and Falou Balora, representing the Thomas Sankara Center for African Liberation and Unity, based in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. Thank you very much for joining us, and how are you both doing this morning?
We're both doing really well. It's sunny and bright out here in Ouagadougou. Thank you so much for having us on. We're so excited to be on the show.
Right on. And with all the activity going on there in the Sahel region today, we are very excited to have you guys on to give us some important context and perspective. So let's dive right in. Can you guys tell us when and why the Thomas Sankara Center was founded?
Okay, so the Thomas Sankara Center has been around almost 2 years now. It's going on 2 years. So I co-founded it with somebody from Burkina Faso out here named Wendy Wilson-Fall. And Fatou, who's on with me, was one of the first people to join in with us and really get the ball rolling on this project. It was founded in response to a growing heightened sort of mass consciousness across the Sahel region and a desire to do something in the legacy of Thomas Sankara, as well as to make connections across the diaspora and various parts of the continent to Burkina Faso, a country that was at the time sort of emerging out of this uprising that happened in 2014 and starting to reconnect with its revolutionary heritage. So the Thomas Sankara Center, that's basically, it was born out of that desire.
Mm-hmm. And what are the primary activities and goals of the center?
So the Thomas Sankara Center is a political education center, first and foremost. So we run a revolutionary Pan-African library where we distribute books that are pretty much otherwise unavailable in Burkina Faso. So we have books by, of course, Thomas Sankara, but also Kwame Nkrumah, Frantz Fanon, Assata Shakur, all sorts of African revolutionaries. So we make those available to the public. People come and check those books out. We also have a lot of political education programming. So we have a Young Pioneers program for primary school youth. That would be like the equivalent of elementary schoolers. So mostly ages 8 to 14 or so, who they come, they learn about the history of Pan-Africanism. They learn about the different resources that are found all across the African continent, and what happens to those resources. We do a lot of creative exercises, art, games, to raise consciousness with the children. And also, I should mention that it's co-run by a former pioneer. So one of our comrades, Osian Sawadogo, was a pioneer during the Thomas Sankara Revolution. So it's really great that he's also part of this, and we're doing that in that legacy. And then we also have a work study circle that meets weekly at the Thomas Sankara Center. We're reading Africa Must Unite by Kwame Nkrumah right now. We're getting started with a second work study circle that's forming now, which is really exciting. And then outside of that, we have all sorts of events and programming. We do film screenings, anything that raises consciousness in that sort of way with the community. We've been collaborating a lot with the Cuban embassy lately this year, doing a lot of events with them. So I think that gives some idea of some of our regular activities.
Now, you mentioned that the center is named after the country's revolutionary Pan-Africanist president, Thomas Sankara, who was assassinated in a coup d'etat led by Blaise Compaoré on October 15th, 1987. Since this date, would it be correct to say that Sankara's name would be somewhat taboo in the country, given the political leadership that followed his assassination? And with that, can you speak to the role that the 2014 uprising, which ousted the 27-year political leader Blaise Compaoré, in freeing Sankara's name from this taboo?
Okay, I'm going to pass this question to our comrade Falou Balora, because she was that had a big impact on her, and she was around here in 2014 as this was going on, as somebody who grew up in Burkina. So she said that Thomas Sankara's name was never really taboo. People were very afraid to speak about Sankara, but it wasn't really taboo in a sense that he was kind of admired silently. So people were like afraid, but they still held that admiration, even if they didn't necessarily, at the time, have the courage to speak up. But things did really change during the 2014 insurrection because people were able to see just the power of the people, the way that they could transform and affect change through that sort of uprising. And now people come out and are very clear that, we are the daughters and sons of Sankara. We are the inheritance of the Sankara legacy. And so it was just like this big eruption in a more public form of reclaiming the Sankara legacy.
So I see that youth education plays a major role in the Thomas Sankara Center's activities. So given the historical context that you just provided, what has been the reception and response of the Burkinabe youth as they learn the country's history now that there is a total outward embrace of Sankara and the country's revolutionary past?
I think what Fatu said was really important here because it's a part of Burkina Faso's history that I think not a lot of people know about. But the insurrection wasn't just like this super spontaneous thing where people got up and they did it one day. The people, even during the Blaise era, there was significant resistance. And so she's talking about how these, the children who grew up under Blaise, like herself, they grew up with the consciousness of what had happened to their country and the wrongdoing that was committed. They grew up knowing that Blaise had assassinated Thomas Sankara. They grew up knowing that the Western countries were implicated in this assassination. And I think something that people don't know a lot about is that the children who grew up during the Blaise era actually grew up participating in public protests and mobilizations with their schools. So from the time of primary, like our equivalent of maybe elementary school, the Burkinabe children would go out with their teachers into the street and cry like justice for Thomas Sankara, justice for Thomas Sankara. So they grew up sort of mobilizing and being encouraged to think politically, even though it was risky and there was suppression during the Blaise era and there wasn't necessarily the same level of sort of political openness and courage that maybe there is right now. They still kind of did grow up having that ingrained in them, that there was this wrongdoing that was committed in their country and that they were responsible from the time of that they're children for going and alongside the adults and speaking about it in whatever way that they can. And so she said the insurrection, actually what it did was to make people just more like publicly outspoken, but there's those kinds of small forms of acts of resistance. And I would say not even necessarily small, elementary schools were mobilizing, but those things had been going on since the time of the assassination. So it's kind of like a reconnection with history, but at the same time, there's always been this sort of desire and this fight to reconnect with that Sankara heritage. It's always kind of been there since the revolution was so abruptly and I think jarringly overthrown.
Okay, with that, bringing the conversation back here to the present, there are some new faces on the scene that are making waves throughout the world. And I'm, of course, speaking to the young leader of the interim government, Ibrahim Traore. Can you share any biographical insights or background on this young, courageous Pan-African leader for our listeners who may be new to hearing his name?
Sure, yeah. So Ibrahim Traore, he is coming up on about a year of power now. I mean, maybe that would be like about a month and some change from today. And so he came into Burkina through a military coup. I'll be transparent and say he wasn't that well known prior to him taking power. So what we've seen is that Burkina Faso has taken a lot of inspiration from the political direction of Mali. So Mali had a coup a couple years prior to Traore taking power in Burkina Faso. And the coup, pretty early on, started positioning itself in a sort of in opposition to France and sort of the traditional Western powers that have dominated in the Sahel. And you really have to understand the level of French control and domination in this region of the world. I mean, it's a part of the world where not only does France occupy these, up until recently, these countries militarily, but these countries also are tied to France through something called the CFA franc currency, which requires 14 countries in Africa, actually technically 15 if we count Comoros. They have a different name for their system, but it works the same way, to use this currency where they hold half of their national reserves in France. The currency is anchored to the euro, so France determines what the value of the currency is, more or less, and has voting and veto power in the regional banks of both West and Central Africa. So there's massive economic power, massive military power, massive French control over a lot of the resources here. Of course, it's not only France, but France operates maybe the most blatantly and overtly and directly. So there's been like this big rise in anti-imperialist consciousness that's been building for years and years. And I first started spending time in the Sahel region around 2018. And I noticed right away that just everywhere around me in this part of the world, it seemed like people were talking about imperialism, whether it was in barbershops or salons. It just seemed like everybody around me was talking about, the French are robbing us, they're exploiting us, we've been colonized by them for hundreds, like 100+ years now. So it started with this mass consciousness. And then Mali kind of was the first country to take this move and really position itself away from the Western camp. And so people in Burkina Faso really started anticipating when would they have sort of a leader like Assimi Goïta of Mali. And so there were 2 coups d'etats that happened in Burkina. The first one was with Damiba, and he exposed himself pretty early on as somebody who was not actually going to take this anti-West, or I should say anti-imperialist, when we say anti-imperialist sort of position. There was a trial for Professor Sankara's assassination. Blaise Compaoré was found guilty, and Damiba immediately pardoned him, which was a huge red flag, and people started to be like, okay, this is not our Mali moment. But then Ibrahim Traoré came around, and what we can say about Traoré is that he chose a prime minister who was very familiar with the people. So even if he himself is kind of a new face, the prime minister he chose was somebody who was involved in the Sankara revolution as a creator of one of the committees for the defense of the revolution, somebody who's a scholar who's written extensively about Sankara. Sankara invited him to be part of the Burkinabe government at the time of the revolution in the 80s. So that was a really good sign already that, okay, the prime minister that he selected was a familiar face. And pretty much since Traoré has come to power, there's been massive mobilizations on the grassroots level calling for certain things. And so far, every sort of major demand coming from the bottom has been received by the top. So the French military was kicked out of Burkina Faso. Those accords were ended. There's been a lot of forms of delinking in terms of like media delinking with France, and then approaching certain partnerships that the Burkinabe people see as more beneficial in the long run than these sort of Western NATO partnerships. And then there's also been major calls for a very close relationship with Mali, to such an extent that people on the ground are calling for a United States of Africa, in that vision of Pan-Africanism that Kwame Nkrumah, Ahmed Sékou Touré, Modibo Keïta had put forward. A lot of people have been calling for that. And so this is something the government has also picked up on, and they've been talking about creating this federation with Mali. Now they're saying that, this is something that they've sat down with Mali. They have a shared military plan. They have a shared plan for industrialization, and that they're working towards having like just unity on every level that they can. Oftentimes implying that they are working towards this idea of like a federal state between the 2 countries. And they invited other countries to join. We're not totally sure, I guess, if those other countries have accepted the invitation, but we know for a fact that Guinea-Conakry was invited and Chad was invited to join. Now there's this whole situation with Niger. Burkina Faso and Mali have begun to issue joint declarations on multiple occasions. The situation in Niger is one example of that, where they said that any invasion of Niger will be considered a declaration of war against Mali and Burkina Faso as well. So we're seeing this like very strong push towards unity and federation, which is another demand coming out of really the grassroots out here.
So what I'm hearing is that the people have been waiting a long time for what we're witnessing today. But, I also wonder, has there been any significant and public opposition to the Traoré government?
No, really, there's not major. I haven't seen it. You know, like people have like critiques of things, which is, I think, you know, any situation we'd always want to be critical. But there's not any like public demonstrations against Traore or like people saying that, you know, it's just overwhelmingly in favor of the leadership right now. What do you think, Fatou? Est-ce qu'il y a une grande opposition à Traore? So she basically said she agreed with me that there's like not really an opposition movement. There are criticisms and stuff, but not like anybody saying like down with Traore. And he's so overwhelmingly popular. People liken him to Sankara and talk about, you know, whether or not this is the revival of like the Sankara era. So yeah, he's very supported.
Right. Well, it isn't hard to see the parallels between the Sankara government and Traore's, especially given his speech, for example, at the second Russia-Africa summit in July. In this, he echoed his revolutionary predecessor's sentiments, calling for an end to imperialist influence in Africa. This also goes for his emphasis on African youth unifying across the continent. So with that, can you speak to the efforts by the Thomas Sankara Center to bring this to fruition and connect and collaborate with like minds across the African continent as well as throughout the diaspora?
She said that, you know, we are a Pan-African center, so we do everything we can to connect with other organizations, and like associations and groups that are fighting for Pan-Africanism, fighting for the total liberation and unification of Africa, that we are working to build stronger relationships with organizations in Mali and Niger, but really all over Africa. She talked about how we wrote a declaration in solidarity with Africans who are in South Africa. And so we had a lot of different organizations sign on to that in support. I'll just add on my end, you know, we've done solidarity events with Haiti, with Sudan, with Senegal. So we try our best to, stay in the Pan-African, we're a Pan-African organization. So we try our best to really have that international scope to our struggle and to connect with organizations both on the continent and the diaspora.
Well, now, of course, in my own personal journey to break away from American colonialism and the legacy of slavery, I, like much of my brothers and sisters in that diaspora, was inspired by the work and legacy of Thomas Sankara, and it even led me all the way to change my last name to Sankara. As a result, seeing this modern day manifestation of that revolutionary legacy, I would love to support in any way that I can. And the Thomas Sankara Center seems without a doubt the best means that I see to directly connect with and support the Burkina Faso people. So with that, how can we in the diaspora support your work at the center?
That's so wonderful, and it's so great to hear. And we're really always trying to build that diaspora continent connection. I think already, you know, having us on the show was a great way already to start to give us this kind of support. Now we get to be in dialogue and communication and really know each other and exchange with each other. So I really think that's one way. I will say that the Thomas Sankara Center is 100% grassroots funded. So we are funded entirely by supporters. We have a Patreon, a GoFundMe, and a Cash App, and that's what allows us to continue our work. So if you're interested in that, our Instagram is Burkina Books, and you can find the links to some of those ways to support us materially through there. But I would say other than that, you know, I would encourage people to continue to invite us on programs like this to learn as much as you can about Burkina Faso, the Sahel region, the African continent, so that we can make these sort of connections. And, you know, we also encourage Africans, if possible, to come to Burkina Faso, to, you know, connect on the ground here, to get to know the folks who are here. So if that is a possibility for anybody listening, you know, come and visit the Thomas Sankara Center. So that's also another way.
Okay, great. And I want to make sure that our listeners have all of your information to be able to get in touch and support. I know that you mentioned that your Instagram page is at Burkina Books, but can you share your Cash App, Patreon, and any other means for folks to support you guys financially?
Yes, thank you. So our Patreon is patreon.com/Burkina Books. And then our Cash App handle is Burkina Books. We have a GoFundMe. I think if you just search like Burkina Faso Pan-African Education on GoFundMe, you'll find it. It will probably be the first one that comes up. So yeah, those are the 3 ways that you can support us materially. Like I said, it really does go a really long way here. We are entirely grassroots funded, and just really just like a little bit of money goes really a long way out here. So we appreciate that a lot.
Well, unfortunately, we'll have to end it there, but I want to thank you both for joining me on the show this morning, sharing your work and some indispensable context on the current happenings in and around Burkina Faso. Thank you for joining us right here on Freedom Now, Sisters Inemesit Richardson and Falou Balora of the Thomas Sankara Center for African Liberation and Unity in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso.
Thank you so much for having us on. Thank you. We really appreciate it.
Merci beaucoup. Barcoso.
Barcoso. That's thank you very much in More. Since you call yourself Sankara, you should know how we say thank you very much. So we say Barcoso.
All right, right on. Well, Barcoso to you and our listeners out there for tuning in. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara for Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles. Stay tuned for more. In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Professor Wendy Wilson-Fall from Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania. Find your local Black-owned bookstore today and get her book, Memories of Madagascar and Slavery in the Black Atlantic. We also want to thank Sisters Inemesit Richardson and Falou Balora for joining us straight from Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. Find out more and support the Thomas Sankara Center for African Liberation and Unity by following them on Instagram at Burkina Books or visiting their Patreon at patreon.com/Burkina Books. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Hit up your favorite bookstore right now and find one of Dr. Horne's many informative texts to enrich your library and your mind. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone and Freedom Now founder Baba Didan Kamati. Shout out to Sister Luyanda Kaboka on the African Drumbeat historical calendar for the week. Shout out to our marvelous engineer. And last but certainly not least, thank you to all of you loyal listeners and supporters out there. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.